Let me begin by this organization where we are, the United Nations. In February 1947, the United Nations appointed the United Nations Special Committee of Palestine, UNSCOP, with 13 member states who knew very little about Palestine, and most of them have never been there before. Maybe this is one of the reasons that they totally misunderstood either the Palestinian position of the United Nations involvement or the general the Arab League position on the Palestine question. All around the Arab world, there were mandatory countries such as Iraq, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, waiting for their independence that was supposed to come through a democratic vote by the people living in those countries to decide the future and character of the liberated new Arab state. Only in Palestine, the very idea that the Palestinians would decide what is the future of Palestine was not accepted by the United Nations. Instead, it suggested that the settler movement of Zionism, most of these settlers came just a few years before to Palestine, that they would have the right to participate in negotiation over the future of Palestine. And even before the United Nations adopted its resolution 181 through the General Assembly on the 29th of November 1947, even before that resolution that gave the settler colonial movement of Zionism more than half of the country, even before that, the Palestinians demanded from the United Nations a far longer process of negotiation so as to explain to them why their rights of self-determination are being denied by the international organization. The American delegation, one should say, in February 1948 suggested 5-year trusteeship over Palestine, which was accepted by the Palestinians in order to give the additional 5 years for negotiating a far more just idea for the future of Palestine. However, under pressure of the Jewish lobby in the United States, President Truman withdrew the American support for the trusteeship trusteeship agreement. In February 1948, the forces of the Jewish community in Palestine began, regardless of what was happening here in the United Nations, began a process that I called in my book in 2007 of ethnically cleansing the Palestinians. In April 1948, most of the Palestinian population that lived in Palestinian towns, or the mixed Arab-Jewish towns of Palestine, were expelled or forced to leave. And we are talking about more than 150,000 Palestinians who lived in the urban space of Palestine who became refugees even before the British Mandate of Palestine on the 15th of May ended. These expulsions from the city were accelerated by acts of massacres, the most known of them, the massacre of Deir Yassin on April the 9th, 1948. So even before the Arab League decided to send military forces in order to try and save the Palestinians on May the 15th, 1948, 250,000 Palestinians were already refugees. And the presence of these refugees in the Arab world forced the Arab governments to do something, although most of them were quite reluctant to participate in any kind of military adventure in Palestine. While the Israeli forces, we should call them now the Israeli forces after the establishment of the State of Israel on May the 15th, 1948, while the Israeli forces were fighting against these contingents from the Arab world, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine continued. The Palestinian villages in the middle of Palestine, in the south, in the north, were overexposed to a tactic that was already articulated by the Jewish forces in a plan that was adopted on the 10th of March 1948. The plan described exactly how the Palestinian villages should be encircled, forced to leave, or evicted by force should this flight not happen. The worst chapter in the Nakba came in October 1948 during the operation that the Israelis called the Hiram operation in the north of Galilee. Even some of the leaders of the Jewish community themselves wrote in their diaries that what the Israelis did in October 1948 was not very different from what the Nazis did in the Second World War. This operation was the toughest because the Palestinians already knew what awaited them, and they were putting a tough resistance, which had led to a list of war crimes and atrocities that completed the ethnic cleansing in Palestine. So within 9 months, half of Palestine's population was expelled, half of Palestine's villages were demolished, and most of the Palestinian towns were wiped out. The Israelis, already in August 1948, began an operation that I call memoricide, in order to wipe out any residue and remnant of the Palestinian existence in Palestine. They built Jewish colonies and settlements over the destroyed Palestinian villages, quite often giving them a Hebrew name, that resembled the Arab name of the village. Thus, Safuria became Tzipori, Lubia became Lavi, and so on. The idea was to say that these were actually ancient biblical places, and therefore this was not a destruction of village, but rather the redemption and the return to the villages. On other villages, the Israelis planted forests. The Israelis imported 10,000 pine trees from Europe to cover the Palestinian villages that were destroyed in the catastrophe of 48. I can tell you, as a second generation of European settler, that we don't do well in the climate of the Middle East, and the same happened to the pine trees of Israel. Many of them became very ill, and where they died, the old orchards and olive trees came back to claim their presence on the land that used to be Palestine and Arab. Let me conclude by saying that I think that any peace process that ignores what happened in 1948, and the peace process so far had totally ignored what happened in 1948, would have at least to rely on 3 principles, which I call the 3 A's. A, for acknowledgement. It's quite amazing how even the top negotiators in the world who deal with Palestine do not acknowledge the catastrophe of 1948. The second is accountability. Acknowledged by itself is useless, as we know, in post-apartheid South Africa. And the only way to make Israel accountable for the ethnic cleansing of 1948, which is a crime against humanity, is to allow the unconditional implementation of Resolution 194 of the United Nations General Secretary, how do you call it? General Assembly, thank you, Riyad. General Assembly resolution sanctioning the unconditional return of the Palestinian refugees to their homeland. And the last A is acceptance. I think that once there is acknowledgement and once there is accountability, not only for the crimes of 48, but for the ongoing crimes since 1948, then the Israelis can ask both the Palestinians and the Arab world to accept them as an organic part of Palestine, of the Arab world, of the Middle East, and be part of its problems and its solutions. Thank you.